It used to be for many, many years thought that the only addiction was alcoholism. We now know that that's simply not true. The word addiction means enslavement. An addict is a slave to alcohol, a slave to drugs, a slave to gambling, a slave to sex. Whatever it is, their brain falls in love with. They get hooked on that, and on their own, they can't stop it. And those three words are very important. On their own. They have to have help outside because it's just too ferocious a disease. What happens to a person's brain in terms of addiction, there are three major parts of the brain that are involved. First of all, dopamine, the neurochemical that is the pleasure reward that we all experience. Anytime we do anything that's fun, that's exciting, interesting, that sort of thing, the brain shoots out a certain amount of dopamine. In the case of addiction, in where the brain is falling in love with this particular chemical or behavior, it floods the brain with dopamine to the point that the brain now is hijacked. It's taken hostage. There's two other parts of the brain. The memory part of the brain remembers the highs, the great experiences, and it wants to repeat those. And they're called triggers. An example of that is I had a man who had an addiction to crack cocaine. And he did work for people, hands-on work, and they'd pay him with cash. His trigger was anytime his hands touched the cash, it set off the fire in his brain and he was off to a crack house. So that's why addicts need to know exactly what their triggers are to recover. The third part is a very important part, is the prefrontal lobe part of the brain, our foreheads. There is where the brain does its whole work in terms of focusing, being able to remember on a short-term basis, and most importantly, its braking system, impulse control. Those three parts become ultra vulnerable. The addiction runs through families primarily because of a genetic piece that makes that person's brain more vulnerable to becoming an addict than someone else without that genetic piece. Now, there are exceptions to that, particularly with the opiate crisis we're now experiencing. One of the stage setters, I'll call it, for addiction is attention deficit disorder. There are two types. Most addicts, in my experience, have one form of attention deficit disorder or the other. In fact, I call it a smart person's disorder because they're usually very bright, very fast thinkers. The problem is their brain is going so fast on them that they can't slow it down. And it's always in kind of a search-seek mode for something that will grab it, something that will interest it, something that will really make them want to focus. And unfortunately, those are usually things like alcohol, drugs. It can also include behaviorals, like people shopping to the point of putting themselves in severe debt, people who steal. There is no cure for addiction. There is recovery, but there is no cure. The most consistent and effective way to recover is through a 12-step program called Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, etc. And what is so powerful about the 12-step program is that they recognize that addiction is not just a brain disorder, it's also a soul disorder. By soul disorder, I mean that essential part of themselves that understands that they need more than themselves to be complete. And that's the whole idea of an otherness. 12 Steps calls higher power, what we Christian people call the developing the mind of Christ. Addiction many times leads to a whole other realm of psychology called trauma. And by trauma, I mean a person who has experienced utter hopelessness and feels like they have just been overpowered by life to the point that they can't go on. The Psychiatric Association listed trauma originally as just another anxiety disorder, but it involves much more than anxiety. It involves terror. A person who is traumatized is terrorized by the experience. They are permanently on high alert. They're constantly feeling like at any moment they can be attacked again. And it isn't something that they consciously do. Their brain does not forget the pain. A traumatized person may not necessarily become an addict, but many people become addicts because of a traumatic experience that they've gone through. To kill the pain, that's all they want to do, is kill the pain. Many, many people have been traumatized as children. Traumatized by being ignored and abandoned, by being beaten up, by being belittled, traumatized by being sexually abused. And these are experiences that people don't just get over. These are traumatic experiences that have to be worked through in a truly effective therapeutic setting. I highly recommend anyone who has had a traumatic experience that they go to people who are certified in the area of EMDR work, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's become the singularly most effective therapeutic tool to help people who are trauma victims. There are people who now feel their brain has let go of this pain entirely, and they can live free from it. And they don't have to use drugs or alcohol or some other substitute like the behavioral substitute like gambling or so forth to alleviate the pain of this. Please know that there is hope. We know more about it now than we've ever known before. We have recovery programs that have brought new life and new hope to people that didn't think there was any way out for them at all.
For more information on how to become a Jobs Partnership volunteer, donate to the program, or to become a participant, please visit our website at jobspartnershippeoria.org.